Hello, my name is Leonie, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be giving you the perfect cozy guide to autumnal reading. So what's the verdict?
I am an autumn.
When it's raining outside and the sun is gone and the days are getting shorter, to me that is the perfect time of the year to really get into reading. But where to start? You know, do you want something cozy? Do you want something scary? Do you want something a little bit more atmospheric? I have created a master list of every autumnal book I have ever read, and I've organized them by vibe, so you can very quickly find what you're looking for in this video using the timestamps. And for every book, I'll give you a super quick overview of who I would recommend it to and who I wouldn't. Speaking of finding the absolute perfect book to read, another great way to do that is with the sponsor of today's video, which is Book of the Month. Let me show you the books that I got from them. So I think Book of the Month is an amazing way to find newly published fiction. So here's how it works. Every month their team carefully goes through all the new releases to curate a short list of the best new fiction that month. Then you get to choose your favorite from their list, which will then conveniently be shipped to your doorstep so you can enjoy the book. I have here Blue Sisters by Coco Malors. I've had this author on my mind for a very long time, so I was super excited to see this in the short list. And then I also have here Phantasma. Sounds like a perfect autumn book. It's like a Hunger Games contest in a haunted manor. Amazing. And what I really love about Book of the Month is that they really focus on new and emerging authors. So every single month I find out about books like this one that I had never even heard about, but that does sound amazing. So join Book of the Month to get to enjoy amazing new books, and for a limited time you can get your first hardcover novel for only $5 using the code Cardigan. So use code Cardigan to get started with Book of the Month for only $5. Okay, let's get started with the novels. This video, by the way, is an updated version of a video that I made 2 years ago, so you're going to see a lot of overlap, but I just wanted to update it with all the autumnal books that I've been reading the past 2 years. I've created categories. Let's start with the first category, which is atmospheric books. Books with a fall-like atmosphere. We start with Piranesi. This is giving early fall, beachy vibes, August, Taylor Swift. Takes place in a Piranesi-esque landscape, and we follow a researcher trying to figure out what's going on in his world. This I recommend to people who love fantasy full of mystery that makes you engage with the content and get a little philosophical with it. And I think if you're a literary fiction reader and you want to dabble into fantasy a little bit, this one is great. So I don't recommend this to people who are looking for like classical, epic, magical fantasy. Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. This is if there was like a fairy tale, but it's also cozy fantasy, but it's also pretty dark with like bones and witches. This is recommended for people who want fairy tales with an older cast in their 30s, people in their 30s, and think that the idea of a dog made of bones is actually really cute. It's a quest story, but don't read this if you, again, want like epic magic quests. And also don't read it if you really love that like cozy legends and lattes fantasy. This is like more in the middle of those two things. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue I recommend to all the sad girls that love sweeping life stories and also love the idea of like dating the devil. Like you always love those kind of shadowy villainous characters, you know what I'm talking about? If you heard about this book and expected like a really deep character study, that's not what you're getting here. It's really more like historical fiction, but it's fantasy. If you think to yourself, man, I'm a little sleepy, I wish I could go to bed right now and just have a really nice dream, The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. Is it a book recommendation video if I don't talk about this book? If you really need a solid plot and characters to latch onto, you're not gonna like this. But if you just want to be swept away on a magical circus ride, perfect for those rainy fall days. I would recommend The Watchmaker of Filigree Street to anyone who is interested in like steampunk 19th century vibes. Enchanted Clockwork. If you're a fan of London, of Japan, and of women in STEM, it is very plot heavy. And again, not very character focused. Sorcery of Thorns is one of those books that classically gets recommended if you like House Moving Castle, if you like books with Ghibli vibes, libraries, quirky demonic characters. But you do have to be okay with a very smooth going fantasy story where things are pretty easy for the main character and the loose ends aren't really tied up very well. Also, if you're like a villain reader, like you really need a very layered, interesting villain to love a book, you should probably also skip this. Again, I'm going to be talking about the book that I keep recommending in every video, and every single time I talk about it, I'm afraid that if I reread, I won't like it anymore. It is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. You know the drill. You get abducted by some dark sorcerer, and then he turns out to be a kind of attractive dark sorcerer. But mostly it's just like magic, soft magic. If you want a hard Brandon Sanderson magic system in your fantasies, this is not for you. Also, if you really struggle with relationships where one of them is like a century-old mage and the other is like a young girl, I understand that this could give you some question marks. But if you want to get lost in the wood, wield a sword, and do some magic, Caraval is a book that I think would be great for people who love circusy magic and kind of snarky banter between characters. I also think if you're just getting into fantasy, this might be something for you. I think if you've already read a lot of those typical magical fantasies like The Night Circus, this one is not going to be very original. Also, don't read this if you're very easily frustrated by main characters that make kind of suboptimal decisions. But you know, she's a teenager. Okay, the next category is gothic novels. I think my favorite type of novel to read during the fall time. Well, you know, it's in the name, Mexican Gothic. This is for anyone that is really into mushrooms right now. I don't mean it that way. I mean it like the aesthetic way. Romanticizing the grotesque. This book is for the people in the overlap, in the Venn diagram, between people who want to get lost in some kind of abandoned spooky manor and people who've been wronged by men. It is like a gothic horror, so it can get a little spooky. For those who don't want their gothic books to get too spooky and horror-y, this can definitely get a little horror-y. And on the other side, for people who like their horror to be like really like scary horror, this is more of a simmering story. Cruel Beauty is a golden oldie that I will always talk about if you really want another Beauty and the Beast retelling with a headstrong woman and like a dark and mysterious man. But this time there's also some Greek myth inspirations there, or more Roman inspiration, I would say. It is very much young adult, so that automatically, just because of the demographic and target audience, means there's kind of a cap on how dark and erotic it can get in the gothic style, you know. Belladonna is one for the people that look at the Grim Reaper and think, why kinda? You ever wanted a gothic romance between literal death and a cutesy main character? Look no further. If you're looking for a story like that to also explore questions about life and death and immortality and ethics, you're not gonna find that here. It's more of a murder mystery, actually, with a gothic romance intertwined. The Last Tale of the Flower Bride is for anyone that loves gothic fiction, but also any kind of mythology. Like, you just love stories and folklore and you just want it all in one story, with fairies as well while we're at it. But if you quickly get annoyed with like purple prose, and again really need like a solid plot to keep you going, this is more one of those no plot dreamlike kind of books. next category is dark fantasy. So books that have, you know, a little bit more of that underbelly demonic vibe to it. I'm so glad I can finally make an autumnal video where I can recommend One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns, the duology by Rachel Gillig. If you love the fall aesthetics of misty woods and cranky trees and dark monsters, and you want that to be a fantasy world, here you go. Don't read this if you want like a really grand scale, in-depth type of world building. The world building remains very kind of simple and small. And also read this if you love a good dose of romance in your fantasy, while the romance stays secondary to the main plot. If you, just getting this out of the way, if you know, maybe you've probably already read this. If you're here, maybe it's time for a Six of Crows reread, right? If you're still mourning the fact that the Shadow and Bone show got cancelled, heal yourself with a reread of Six of Crows. Don't recommend this to people who are a little bit tired of the heist formula, or if you have trouble connecting with morally grey characters. Or on the other hand, if you really love super dark, grimdark, morally grey characters, this is still YA, so it's never gonna get that dark, you know? But if you want character-focused, urban, dark fantasy, with angst, so much angst, this will forever be the best out there. The Library of the Unwritten. This is for people for which a great concept can really make or break a book for you, because the concept here is really cool. It's about people who go to the afterworlds of all kinds of different religions. It's super actiony, super plot focused, and also not very long. So I don't recommend this to people who kind of need to take some time to get attached to characters before you start caring about them in action scenes. The Dark Days Club is a book that I would recommend to anyone who likes, you know, Pride and Prejudice and Little Women and all of those period pieces, and thought to themselves, this would be cooler if these women were also demon slayers. The concept of this book is really exploring the main character's choice to join like the whole demon slayer thing. So if you're expecting more of a Mortal Instruments vibe where we immediately get into the action, that doesn't really happen. It is more focused on like the ethics behind it, I would almost say. If you mostly just want the demon slaying, this will disappoint a little bit. Kingdom of the Wicked by Carrie Maniscalco, I would recommend to people who really love young adult fantasy romance, romantasy, with again a demony dark love interest. This is every book nowadays. And also very sassy main characters. If you're looking for, you know, more like in-depth characters and very like tight-knit kind of world building, I don't think you would like it. But if you're really just here for the romantasy of it all, I know this is super popular. And lastly, in dark fantasy, I would recommend the graphic novel Monstress. I'm just gonna show you the art style. Absolutely gorgeous. If you love lots of world building and like very unique kind of steampunky dark fantasy combinations, you're really gonna enjoy this. If you read One Dark Window, you like the trope of a main character with a monster inside of them, this has that too. But I don't think it's great for people who get easily lost in like too much world building, especially in a graphic novel. Can sometimes be difficult. So what if you want to read a bit of a spooky book for October and Halloween, but you don't want it to actually be that scary? I always recommend The Girl and the Ghost. It's a ghost story inspired by Malaysian folklore, but it's a children's novel or like middle grade, so it never really gets too scary, and it's mostly very wholesome about like the friendship between a ghost and a girl. But yeah, if you're not really into middle grade, don't read this. Don't be one of those people that picks up a middle grade book and then starts complaining that it's too childish, okay? If you really like Tim Burton's movies, Coraline is a staple. I will say, if you have seen the movie Coraline a lot, the book is almost exactly the same, so it probably won't have that much of an impact on you anymore. But if it's been a while or you haven't even seen the movie yet, but you know you like those creepy, also circusy vibes. But if you like those creepy family trouble in the muddy woods vibes, Coraline's for you. City of Ghosts by V. Schwab, another ghost story. If you really like Scotland, if you want kind of like adventures with ghost hunting, don't read this if you get annoyed by excessive pop culture references and like Harry Potter references. It's very much giving an American who was a very, very big fan of the United Kingdom, you know, like Britcore kind of vibe. So if you don't like that, skip this one. And then my favorite ghost series, actually I think all of these books I'm recommending are middle grade. Yeah, well, my favorite ghostly middle grade book is Lockwood & Co. Read this if you watched the Netflix show and again were really disappointed that they canceled it. Read the books. Again, it's about ghost hunters, but they have swords to hunt the ghosts. That's super cool. It's very like adventure-y, questy, action-packed. It's like higher middle grade, so don't read this if you don't like to read about 14-year-olds very much acting their age. I have some horror recommendations. I don't read a lot of horror and I probably should read more horror. So if you have recommendations, let me know. But these are the ones that I've read. Tender is the Flesh is great for anyone that likes horror used to explore ethical questions. This one is really about the ethics of eating meat. If you like gore and using cannibalism as a metaphor for human depravity, I will say sometimes it's a little bit like gory for the sake of gory, so if you are not a fan of that. As a vegetarian, I really thought this book would go more into kind of like the question around vegetarianism, but it doesn't really do that much. Wilder Girls is for anyone that loves horror in the unsettling kind, like if you really like the movie Annihilation, for example. And it also has a sapphic romance if you're looking for that. This is not for people who are easily weirded out, or I would say for people who don't enjoy being weirded out, because I was very pleasantly weirded out by all the weird things happening in this book. I would call this like weird horror, not like scary horror. Existential, oh my gosh, what is my body kind of horror. So if you are more looking for kind of like the gore, scary type of horror, then this might not be your thing. If you like the idea of horror retellings of fairy tales, you should read the books by Christina Henry. I've read Alice, which is just a very retelling of Alice in Wonderland. Again, don't read this if you don't like horror for the sake of horror, or like trauma and torture for the sake of trauma and torture. These books don't really have a goal or a message. They're horror to make you feel things, you know? Another horror retelling of classic fairy tales comes together in the book of Lost Things. Don't read this if you don't want your childhood dreams to be crushed. But if that sounds cool to you, and if you would love to be swept away into some kind of dark fairy tale forest that's super duper creepy, going back to kind of more like unsettling type of horror, I have here the short story collection by Thomas Ligotti. He's often recommended as like a great author of existential horror. These are stories that are written to leave you with a very unsettled, uneasy feeling. So if that's the type of horror you're looking for, read this. Again, if you do want the more kind of like gory, scary stuff, this is not gonna make you feel scared. I wasn't scared while reading this. And then a book that I think technically also counts as horror, I am gonna count it as horror, is Juniper and Thorn. Again, not like big scary horror, more like unsettling and disturbing, which I guess tends to be my favorite kind of horror now that I'm looking at this list. It's very female rage horror. I would avoid this if you don't really want to read about topics like family abuse or sexual trauma, because that is kind of the main source of the horror here. But hey, there's a female character overcoming her struggles, so. Ooh, and then the book that I read last year, the book that made me realize that I do actually like horror, it is Slewfoot by Brom. I need to read his other books as well. Oh, this was so good. Read this if again you love the idea of like female rage, women coming to get their retribution, you know? Also, if you love the idea of a kind of a love interest that's kind of like a devilish demon, but like actually in like the horror way, as in he's a goat. He is a goat. There's some torture in this, so if you don't like that, avoid it. I always describe this if a Ghibli movie like Princess Mononoke was horror. Oh, and then I don't know if it counts as a horror, maybe more dark fantasy. We're seeing a theme here. If again you're like, I want fairy tale retellings, but I want them to be really dark, read Angela Carter. This is not just the Bloody Chamber, but this entire collection is a lot of her fairy tale retellings, and they tend to be really unsettling, really dark. Again, strong themes of sexual trauma oftentimes, but it also falls into the category of stories about women getting their retribution or not. I should have put this in the gothic novels, I think. If you love a lyrical writing style in short stories, you're gonna love this. Then I have a very, very brief category of romance novels. There are so many autumnal, witchy, spooky romance novels out there. I've read only one. I can only talk to you about one, but just know that there's like tons of witchy, silly romances out there. And I've only read The Ex-Hex, which I think falls in the extremely silly side of this category. If you just want a really silly, funny, small town story between two witches, you're really gonna enjoy this. If you very easily cringe at situations where characters are very clearly just put in because it's a romance novel, this may be a little too silly for you. I'm also going to talk here about Bride by Ellie Hazelwood. I think, you know, a vampire werewolf romance is perfect for fall. Extremely silly and unserious. Like, you can tell the author isn't really taking herself seriously, but I personally think that is what makes this book fun. If you're looking for slightly more like serious romantasy, don't read this. And also, I don't know, you just have to be open to a lot of spicy scenes between vampires and werewolves, and you just gotta open your mind a little bit to it. But some people are really not gonna like that, and I totally understand this. I had trouble with it as well. And the last one, another extremely different vibe, I would recommend A Dowry of Blood. I'm putting it in romance, but honestly, it could also go into gothic. This is on the one hand very much about like abusive romance, using vampirism and vampires and Dracula to write a story about abusive relationships, but then there's also nice relationships coming up between people trying to get back at the abusive one. Love it when that happens. Again, you have to be open to kind of vampire spicy scenes. Also, don't read this if you're quick to find writing styles a little pretentious, because this one again falls into the kind of purple prosy, almost pretentious type of very lyrical writing style. There are a lot of classics out there that I think have very autumnal vibes. Frankenstein is like the main one. If you love mad scientists, questions about what it means to be human, dark academia vibes, how to live with guilt of existing, you're gonna love this. And you think of the typical green monsters from all the movies, you're gonna be disappointed by this. Like, this is not scary horror hoo-hoo monster. It's more like scary horror, oh, I am alive. That stuff. Okay, if after me recommending it a gazillion times, you still haven't read The Yellow Wallpaper, now is the perfect time. To everyone who probably would have been diagnosed with hysteria back in the day, if you want an interesting look at how sexism manifested itself in the 19th century. Don't read this if you don't like psychological horror. I think people sometimes forget that this classic it's kind of horror, very psychological. Again, will leave you with very unsettling feeling. Another book that will leave you with a very unsettling feeling, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, another short story. This is for if you loved The Hunger Games, and specifically we're very intrigued by the concept of the reaping and this idea of everyone just kind of going along with it and just letting it happen, that specifically is explored in this short story. The complicity of the people. If you are really sensitive to this unsettling tension between people, stories that make you feel very uneasy, again, this may not be for you. The Picture of Dorian Gray is for those of us who would love to read a good old corruption arc, you know, the bad side of humanity. Narcissism and beauty and how your friends can manipulate you. A lot of this story is just long conversations, kind of philosophical conversations between characters. So if you very quickly find that annoying or a little pretentious, then I don't think The Picture of Dorian Gray is for you. If you would like to read a little bit of poetry, then autumn is of course the perfect time for some John Keats. It's literally on the cover of the book, it's just autumn. I don't know a lot about poetry, but these are just the kind of poems where you can read honestly anything and it makes you reappreciate the nature around you. I love making little doodles in this book. John Keats was the original, oh, let's romanticize life. He's definitely an over-the-top drama queen though, so if you don't like your poetry like that, search for something else. This is also that classic rhyme scheme typical poetry, so if you want like something more modern, more freestyle, this may not be for you. Other than that, I think it's a great intro to poetry. I say as someone who doesn't really read a lot of poetry. I did enjoy this. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. If there's any time that you are going to be reading about the story of obsessive romance and just two people being completely intertwined in a very toxic way, it should be in the fall, because there's gonna be a lot of like misty moors and ghosts in this novel. Do skip this if you don't like characters that are just a little annoying. Like, no one is likable in this book, and that's what makes it good. But if you don't like that, don't read a classic. The idea of a book about obsession and violence and death should entice you, and if it doesn't, you're just gonna be super annoyed by the lack of communication between these characters. We Have Always Lived in a Castle by Shirley Jackson. Again, for my mushroom lovers, for people who like the idea of just hiding away in a house with all of your own food in jars and all that stuff. The main character at some point says that she wishes she had like her own little moon to live on, and if you relate to that, I think you're gonna enjoy this book. It's a little bit more like unsettling in like the family dynamics. Based on the cover, you could expect very much like a dark cottagecore naturey vibe, but it's a little bit more character and family focused actually. Last but certainly not least, let's go over some dark academia novels. I do have a full video that I also made 2 years ago where I really go in depth into dark academia and every dark academia novel that I've read, but I'll just quickly go over the ones that I think have the most autumnal vibes and then also the new ones that I've read since I made that video. The classic ones are of course The Secret History and If We Were Villains. I'll be quick about The Secret History, but I don't recommend this to people who think that this book is going to be like the ultimate dark academia aesthetic and like want to be like that. Like, you have to understand that going into this book that it is a satire and that it critiques everything that you might love about like your dark academia Pinterest board. But if that sounds good to you, you're gonna love it. And then If We Were Villains, I would say is more specifically to the people who are also really into theater and acting. And if that is not necessarily your passion and like Shakespeare and stuff, I'm sure there's another dark academia book that is more your cup of tea. And then if you want there to be a more of a fantasy twist to it, you should pick up The Atlas 6, which again, if you are very quick to find certain conversations between characters to be pretentious, you're gonna find this book pretentious. I could say that about every dark academia book, to be honest. But this is great if you love good characters. And then if you've read all like the classic dark academia books and you're like, there's something to be said about dark academia and its popularity and what it romanticizes, you should read Babel by R. Huang, which she kind of wrote as like a response to the popularity of like The Secret History and everything. This one goes very deep into anti-colonialism, anti-racism, the erasure of language. It's very political, very, very good. The only thing that I'll say about this, if you are someone who easily gets annoyed when political messages or any kind of message gets is a little bit on the nose and gets like really pushed into the front, you might find this a little bit annoying because it's not subtle. Nothing about this book is subtle. If you're like, hey, I want dark academia, but I want it to have that feeling of like a codependent relationship that you have with, you know, your first queer love, and like weird tension that you have between friends, but also you would murder for them. Obsession and Death. We love it. It's not like a murder mystery, high tension kind of dark academia, more character focused. But on the other hand, if you want your dark academia to be more of that, just like fun, cozy mystery, murder mystery vibe, boarding school vibe, without more of the like philosophical or political layer behind it, then we have Truly Devious. I would call this a rainy day whodunit. That is great if you are a fan of quirky and eccentric characters. It's a little bit more lighthearted and easy to read, so I would skip it if you really want like a super well written, in-depth murder mystery. A Study in Drowning, another Ava Reid. This is for if you are very annoyed with like the erasure of women in literature and the underappreciation of women in literature. It's that perfect combination between dark academia and gothic, because there's a creepy mention in there. It's still Ava Reid, so don't read this if you are quickly uneasy with unsettling type of writing style. And again, there's a lot of strong themes around sexual trauma in here as well. Man, those were a lot of books to talk about. I'm sure there's at least something in there that you can pick up this fall, I hope. And if you have more recommendations, please leave them in the comments. We can all recommend some autumnal books to each other. It is way too hot to be wearing this cardigan right now because it's still very hot here in the Netherlands. It's basically still summer, but oh well, we can pretend, right? Anyway, I want to give a big thanks to all of my patrons, with a shout out to all of my elite Patreon members whose names that you can see here. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I really hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you soon in another video very soon. Goodbye!